Jamin was born on March 31, 1989 in Independence, Louisiana. Although there is very little known about his early life and details such as the names of his parents or the schools he attended remain a mystery, one thing that is known for certain about Jamin's childhood is that he had a sister named Chastity Jackson. Despite the lack of information about their early years, it was clear that the two of them shared a special bond that could not be broken. Growing up in Independence, Louisiana, the siblings relied on each other for comfort, support, and love, and as they grew older, their relationship only grew stronger. People who knew Jamin describe him as a sweet young man who was always beaming with joy and spreading kindness wherever he went. Everyone who crossed his path was struck by his infectious smile and warm heart. His gentle personality and quiet disposition made him a beloved figure among his family and friends. He also had a deep love for his family, whom he held close to his heart. But there was more to Jamin than just his kind-hearted nature. He was a gifted artist who had a talent for drawing. His sketches were a reflection of his boundless imagination and his ability to capture the essence of the world around him. Jamin was also a devoted member of his church community, regularly volunteering his time and resources to help those in need. Apart from this, Jamin also had a close friend by the name of Monterey Page. Monterey lived in the same neighborhood and attended the same school as Jamin. He was also well known by Jamin's family. Despite Jamin being 4 years older, the two got along quite well. There was no doubt that Jamin's days were filled with laughter, love, and endless possibilities. He had his whole life ahead of him, with plans and dreams that seemed like they would soon be within reach. But when they least expected it, things took a turn for the worse. July 23, 2010 started out like any other day for Jamin. He got out of bed and started his morning routine, completely oblivious to the fate that awaited him. As he went about his usual business, running errands and taking care of responsibilities, little did he know that he was completing a sequence of events that would ultimately lead to his untimely death. Perhaps if he had known what was going to happen, he would have chosen to remain indoors throughout the day rather than venture outside. Some minutes before 11 p.m. on that fateful day, an emergency call came to the Independence Police Department. The caller, who seemed to be in a state of panic, reported that someone was lying unconscious on Kem Street near a roadside ditch. It was unclear how long the person had been lying there, but the caller urged the police to hurry. The police officers on duty immediately sprang into action and rushed to the scene as fast as they could. When the police arrived at the scene, they were greeted with a chilling sight. A young man, barely clinging to life, lay motionless near a roadside ditch. Despite the absence of any visible physical injury or blood on his body, it was clear that he was in a terrible state. The officers' minds raced as they tried to figure out what could have happened to him. They began to suspect that the young man had been a victim of a hit-and-run driver, as there were no other signs of foul play in the area. Officers knew that time was of the essence and they had to act quickly to save his life. With the help of paramedics, they carefully loaded the young man into a waiting ambulance, hoping that he would make it to the hospital in time. With sirens blaring, they rushed to the Lally-Kemp Regional Medical Center. Upon arrival at the hospital, the doctors quickly stabilized the young man and assessed his condition. The news was not good. He had suffered from multiple head injuries and his life hung by a thread. Knowing the gravity of the young man's injuries, the doctors transferred him to St. Tammany Medical Center, one of the best hospitals in the state. As the doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to keep the young man alive, more information about him began to surface. Shockingly, it turned out to be none other than Jamin. His family were soon contacted and they rushed to his side at the hospital. With hearts heavy with fear and anguish, they prayed and hoped for a miracle. But as the hours ticked by, their worst fears were confirmed. Jamin's condition was critical, and the doctors soon prepared him for surgery. The surgery was successful, but Jamin's recovery was slow and uncertain. The medical team decided to transfer him to the New Orleans University Hospital, where he could receive the best possible care. Despite the doctors' best efforts, Jamin's condition continued to deteriorate and his family's hope began to fade. They clung to every shred of optimism, but deep down they knew that they were facing the unthinkable. On July 25, 2010, just 2 days after his fight began, Jameen passed away. His family was devastated. They couldn't believe that he had been taken away from them so suddenly, and in such a tragic way. The following day, after Jameen's death, the Tangipahoa Parish Coroner's Office scheduled an autopsy to determine the cause of his fatal injuries. The examiner's findings revealed that Jameen's death resulted from internal closed head injuries. The injuries also suggested that the vehicle that possibly hit him was slow-moving, which only added to the mystery of what happened that fateful night. As the news of Jameen's tragic death spread, a cloud of sadness and confusion descended upon the quiet town of Independence. Detectives of the Independence Police Department wasted no time in launching a full-scale investigation into the incident. They were determined to unravel the mystery behind Jameen's untimely demise. They began to meticulously piece together all the events of that fateful night, hoping to find the answers. The detectives faced a daunting task, and they were not sure where to start. Who was the reckless driver that had possibly struck Jameen and left him for dead on the side of the road? And if it wasn't a hit-and-run incident, what exactly had happened to Jameen on that night? These and many more questions plagued the detectives. As the investigation into Jameen's death continued, detectives made a crucial discovery. The person who found Jameen lying on the roadside was none other than his friend and neighbor, Monter. With this revelation, the police immediately turned to Monter for answers, hoping that his account of events could provide valuable insight into what really happened on that night. However, even after several rounds of questioning, the police were still no closer to solving the case. The mystery surrounding Jameen's death only deepened, leaving detectives more frustrated. Jameen was soon laid to rest. The funeral was attended by many who had known him and loved him. After the funeral, the investigation into Jameen's death continued with renewed vigor. Detectives interviewed numerous individuals, but nothing came of it. The authorities even asked the public for help, urging anyone with information to come forward. The passing of time did not ease the pain felt by Jameen's loved ones. Each anniversary of his death brought renewed heartache, and the desire for justice remained strong. Despite the trail going cold, the authorities never gave up hope of solving the case. Unfortunately, the investigation yielded no concrete leads, and the case eventually went cold. Around 2017, the case was reopened. However, the Independence Police Department once again found themselves at a dead end regarding Jameen's case. With limited resources and no leads, they knew they needed to help find a breakthrough. Desperate, they turned to the Tangipahoa Parish Sheriff's Office for assistance. The Sheriff's Office then stepped in, bringing their expertise to the table in a bid to unravel the mystery behind Jameen's tragic death. Detective Mike Sticker took charge of the case and began working tirelessly alongside Independence Police Chief Frank Edwards. The two men and several other detectives spent countless hours poring over the facts, determined to find any new leads that could potentially bring justice for Jameen. They believed that the community held the key to solving the case, and so they once again turned to the public for help. Remained hopeful that media coverage of the case would jog someone's memory or conscience and encourage them to come forward. 6 long years later, in January 2023, the breakthrough in Jameen's case finally came when a mysterious witness, whose identity was kept confidential, stepped forward. The witness had been carrying a heavy burden of guilt and finally felt compelled to come clean. His story was nothing short of jaw-dropping, and took the investigation in a completely different direction. According to the witness, Jameen's death had not been caused by a hit-and-run driver as previously thought, but by someone close to him. The individual told police that the person responsible for Jameen's death was his friend Monter. While the exact details of the witness account are still undisclosed by detectives, the gravity of Monter's actions were finally revealed. Following this, detectives began to look for him. His whereabouts were finally traced to Chambers County, Texas, and on February 10, 2023, officers finally arrested him. Even though he had been 17 when Jameen died, authorities decided to charge him as an adult. Up until 3 years ago, once you reached the age of 17, you were considered an adult offender in the state of Louisiana, said Tangipahoa Parish Sheriff Jimmy Travis. Monter was charged with second-degree murder, multiple failure to appear counts, and 1 charge of jumping bail. As it turns out, Monter's legal troubles seemed to have started long before he became a suspect in Jameen's murder. He had been previously arrested and had pleaded guilty to multiple drug charges. This was back on November 16, 2021. At the time, the court had ordered him to wear an ankle monitor and return for sentencing 3 days later on November 19th. However, instead of complying with the court order, Montre decided to flee to Chambers County, Texas, and also removed his ankle monitor illegally in the process. News of Montre's arrest for the murder sent shockwaves through the community, especially to Jameen's grieving family. At first, they could hardly believe it when they heard that their son's own friend was responsible for his tragic death. But as the reality set in, a sense of relief washed over them. The rest of the community also struggled to come to terms with the truth behind the case. It was a betrayal that cut deep, and people wondered how something so senseless could happen between two friends. Many were left with lingering questions and a sense of unease. But above all, there was a collective hope that this would bring closure for everyone involved. On February 27, 2023, Montre pleaded guilty to several charges in the drug-related case and was sentenced to 90 years in prison. At the moment, he is also awaiting trial for the murder of Jameen. After a long investigation, the truth behind Jameen's death finally came to light. Thanks to the perseverance of law enforcement and the bravery of a witness who came forward, justice was served. While nothing can bring back Jameen, his family and the community can finally have closure and begin to heal. But what do you think would have happened if the witness had not come forward with the information that Jameen was murdered by his friend Montre instead of being a victim of a hit and run? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. June 26, 2004 was a serene day in Wright City, Missouri. However, the city was stunned when a maintenance worker stumbled upon a gruesome discovery in a rest area along the bustling Interstate 70. While trimming the brush, the maintenance worker noticed something suspicious. Out of curiosity, he went to investigate it further and ended up uncovering a decapitated torso. The sight sent shockwaves down his spine. He immediately called the police and informed them about what he had found. It was a discovery that shocked the town of Wright City. The human remains had no head or limbs and was simply a torso. Since the remains were found in a secluded area, investigators theorized that the body was dumped in this area, but the victim was most likely killed elsewhere. But what they found provided more questions than answers. The torso was dressed in a simple black bra, and there were scars from a previous appendectomy and C-section visible on her body, but not much else. All the investigators found at the crime scene were some DNA samples on the victim's body and a knife. After an initial examination of the crime scene, her torso was taken for an autopsy, but because the body was without hands, legs, and a head, it eliminated almost all possible ways in which she could be identified, making it impossible to know who the victim was and how she ended up in that place. As there was not much evidence found at the crime scene, police were relying on the autopsy report for more information. But unfortunately, even the autopsy report could not pinpoint an exact cause of death. It was suggested that the neck had been ruthlessly severed, but it was impossible to clearly say how she met her demise. Initially, it was believed that she was a victim of organ trafficking, but they found that no organs had been removed from the body, which indicated that the murder was not to steal her organs. The case left investigators scratching their heads as they tried to piece together the puzzle of her final moments. The discovery set off a major investigation, with many detectives working tirelessly to find any leads that would help solve it. This was the start of a lengthy investigation, which would puzzle police for many years to follow. As a first step, investigators interviewed people who lived in the nearby area and urged them to jog their memory in search of something unusual they might have witnessed in the area around the time of the discovery of the remains. Some witnesses said that they saw a white utility van in the area the day before the torso was discovered. But while that information looked promising, it did not generate any new leads. Even after a thorough investigation, the police could not come up with any suspects. Without much evidence or suspects, the case eventually went cold. The investigation was reignited in 2014, when Lieutenant Matt Schmutz of the Warren County, Missouri Sheriff's Department took over the case and started to investigate missing persons in the area that matched the characteristics of the victim. The following year, he began to talk with investigators in Madison County, Illinois, on a missing persons case that shared similar traits. Then in April 2006, a person who could have been from the woman's family whose name went to the Warren County Sheriff's Department. When he realized that the torso could be his sister's, he provided DNA for an identity test, but the testing was inconclusive. Brian refused to give up on finding his sister's killer, even when all hope seemed lost. Even though his initial attempt to provide DNA evidence failed, he didn't give up. After years of failed attempts to identify the remains found in rural Missouri, a new lead was finally uncovered. This lead was Ashley Kinnear, who was likely the oldest daughter of the woman, and who was contacted due to information Brian gave to the police. An expert suggested getting DNA samples from the woman's relatives, including her oldest daughter Ashley Kinnear and 2 other siblings. Thankfully, they agreed to provide the DNA for testing, which ultimately led to a breakthrough in the case. And in 2016, the Missouri lab found a match. Finally, the identity of the torso was revealed. It was stated that the victim was Deanna Dennis Howland, also known by her aliases Deanna Froelich or Deanna Kinnear. Records show that Deanna was married more than once and had multiple aliases, including Deanna Barker, Deanna Kinnear, and Deanna Froelich. She had at least 2 children and was born in Belleville, Illinois in the United States. Despite her struggles and the difficulties she faced in life, Deanna Dennis Howland was a person with hopes and dreams, loved by her family and missed by those who knew her. Her tragic death at the hands of a murderer is a reminder that every person, no matter their struggles, is deserving of justice and respect. Deanna was a woman who lived a troubled life, battling addiction and often living as a transient. She was known to frequent areas of Illinois such as Granite City and East St. Louis and was recognized by many as a prostitute who had problems with the consumption of illegal drugs. Despite her struggles, Deanna was a caring mother to her children. Her daughter Ashley Kinnear remembers her as a loving and devoted parent. Ashley became concerned about her mother's well-being when her mother failed to show up for a school play that she had promised to attend in May 2004, and there was no further contact after that. Deanna's disappearance was out of character, and her daughter knew something was wrong when her mother didn't even call her on her birthday, something she never missed. For all this time, Ashley had been confused and disheartened regarding her mother's disappearance. She had tried to contact every possible person she could think of or knew about, but still she had gotten no information about her mother. The only thing she could do was wait for her mother to show up one day. From this, it is clear that despite her troubles, Deanna was clearly a caring and loving mother who always made an effort to stay in touch with her children. Authorities finally made a breakthrough in the case of Deanna Dennis Howland in 2022. The suspect was found with the help of a DNA report. The DNA that investigators got from Deanna's body and from the knife which was found at the crime scene was what finally helped them crack the case. The defendant, whose identity has been released, was linked through his DNA evidence that investigators found on Deanna's body. Took years of testing and analysis through forensic genetics to make the connection, but the evidence was finally conclusive in 2022, which led them to a 63-year-old man. The man was identified as Mike Anthony Clardy, a longtime resident of Maryland Heights, Missouri. The quiet life that Mike Clardy and his wife were leading came to an abrupt end when police arrested Clardy on January 10, 2023 at their Maryland Heights home. This wasn't the first time Clardy's life was disrupted, as he had an accident in 2004 that rendered him legally blind. But this time it was due to his alleged involvement in this heinous crime. The suspect was able to hide from the police for 2 decades but was finally identified. Court records show that Clardy was not linked with any other killings and did not have a criminal record. But now Clardy is facing second-degree murder charges in relation to the killing of Deanna Howland. The next step was to uncover the whole truth behind the heinous crime. Clardy, who had been compliant with the arrest, was brought in for interrogation. As the detectives probed, and more crucially about the remains that were found, In 2023, after almost 2 decades, justice was finally served for Deanna Dennis Howland as her killer Mike Clardy was charged for her murder. The St. Louis prosecuting attorney's office filed an indictment stating that Clardy confessed to killing Howland in June 2004, as well as scattering her remains across multiple locations. Despite his initial denial of involvement, Clardy reportedly admitted to officers that he murdered Howland after a disagreement in his home, where she had been working as a sex worker. He admitted to spreading the victim's remains throughout the St. Louis and Warren counties. He is currently being held on a bond of $1 million in Warren County as the investigation continues. The announcement of the indictment by the Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis marked a significant breakthrough in a joint investigation between multiple law enforcement agencies. If found guilty, Clardy may face a lengthy prison sentence of up to 40 years. Finally, the truth is being unveiled and justice may finally be served for Deanna Howland nearly 2 decades later. Howland's loved ones never lost hope that the perpetrator of the heinous crime would one day be brought to justice. And finally, after years of tireless investigation, Clardy was apprehended and the veil of mystery surrounding Howland's murder was lifted. As the sheriff's office released details of the case, the community was left in shock and disbelief, learning of the DNA evidence and other gruesome details that had been withheld for years. Though they will never have her back, her friends and family can find solace in the fact that justice has finally been served. At a press conference in St. Louis, Deanna Howland's daughter, Kenia, expressed her gratitude towards everyone who had taken an interest in her mother's story. It was an emotional moment as she thanked the crowd for their support and for not giving up on her mother's case. Kenia revealed how she always knew that something had happened to her mother and that she would never have abandoned her family without a word. She appreciated the fact that people were interested in getting to know who her mother was and the impact she would have had on their lives if she were still alive. It is clear that Deanna was a kind and devoted woman who meant the world to her loved ones. Kenia's words touched the hearts of many, reminding us all of the importance of not forgetting the lives of those lost and the loved ones they leave behind. The case of Deanna Howland is a tragic reminder of the impact that violent crimes can have on individuals, families, and communities. The arrest and confession of Clardy may bring closure to those affected by Howland's murder, but it can never fully undo the harm that was done. Ultimately, it is up to the justice system to hold the perpetrator accountable for their actions. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. 20 miles from Sacramento, Dixon was incorporated into Solano County in 1878. Those that call it home get to enjoy a suburban lifestyle without the rush of big city living. It is a farming community known for its alfalfa fields, dairy farms, and sheep farms. Dixon also plays host to the annual Lambtown Festival and the Mayfair, the oldest state fair in California. Dixon became the focus of a crime that shocked the small farming community when the body of a young woman was found in a cornfield. On August 3, 1980, at around 3 p.m. in the height of summer in the United States, 2 cornfield workers were busy clearing a field near Seavers Road in Dixon. As they made their way through the stalks of corn, on the ground they noticed something unusual. The men cleared a path and discovered the body of a young woman. Without hesitation, they called their manager, who contacted the police immediately. Within moments, officers from the Solano County Sheriff's Office arrived and cordoned off the scene. It was ruled a homicide as the victim appeared to have been shot multiple times. They searched the immediate area for clues but found nothing. There was nothing belonging to the victim in the area, nor any form of identity. After questioning other workers and potential witnesses, they received no answers to their growing questions. Investigators surmised that the young woman was killed elsewhere and dumped in the cornfield as it was close to the road. The victim's body was taken to the county mortuary for a full autopsy. The cause of death was ruled as homicide by gunshot wounds. She had been shot 6 times in the head and neck. There were no signs of a sexual assault or defensive wounds. Using the victim's fingerprints, investigators tried to search various databases to find any record that would help identify her. A search of missing person databases didn't provide any leads, nor did the victim have any criminal records. She was named as the Dixon Jane Doe. and a profile was developed with pictures and a composite. In the report, she was described as being white with brown eyes and dark brown hair cut into a punk rock style. She also had a small dark mole on the left side of her chin. The coroner estimated her age to be between 15 and 23. Her height was measured at 5 feet and 2 inches and her weight at 155 pounds. At the time of her death, she was wearing a green wool sweater and a light blue long-sleeved smock with wooden buttons, a small floral design, and a safety pin that was used to secure the top together. On her left finger was a white metal spoon ring, and she was also wearing a wooden bead necklace. Despite the information being made available to all local police departments and sheriff's offices, the victim's case grew cold quickly. The leads dried up and tips were few and far between. Investigators kept checking back with the victim's fingerprints, but nothing was found on any systems. The victim's remains were buried in a Solano County cemetery a month after the body was discovered and marked as a Dixon Jane Doe. The case grew cold. Periodically, investigators would look through the file. It was 10 years later they received a new lead. On June 19, 1992, the Solano County Sheriff's Office received new information regarding the Dixon Jane Doe case. The National Missing Persons Unit contacted the investigation team regarding a missing persons report made by Augustine and Sally Campilia on May 12, 1992. They reported that their daughter, 21-year-old Hollyanne Campilia, went missing in July 1980. They had reported Hollyanne missing in July 1980 after receiving a letter from her that stated she did not want to have any more contact with them. They tried to trace the address on the letter but discovered that it was from a fake street address. Hollyanne's parents then discovered that the missing persons report that they filed initially in July 1980 was somehow deleted from the national database 2 weeks after it was made. Investigators ran the details received through the database. They also requested DNA samples to test against that of their Jane Doe. 5 weeks later, the Campilia family received the devastating news that Hollyanne was, in fact, the Dixon Jane Doe. Hollyanne Campilia was born in 1959 to parents Augustine and Sally Campilia. She was the eldest of 5 daughters and raised in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. She was a free spirit according to her family and always cheerful. She adored her sisters and often sewed their dresses and helped with styling their hair. Her father Augustine said she was a talented and artistic person. Life had seemed to be on track for Hollyanne as she was performing well in school, scoring straight A's. However, it was in her senior year in 1976 that Hollyanne began to change. Her parents noticed her withdrawing from the family and then discovered she had started abusing substances. They also noticed the change in her mental health and her emotional breakdowns. What they couldn't understand was the root cause of her problems. Despite her personal problems, Hollyanne went on to enroll at the Glassboro State College studying toward a degree in fine arts. It was then that she started to behave erratically again. Hollyanne began running away from home. The first incident occurred in 1977. She disappeared for over a month before her parents found her, walking along Route 70 about a mile from their home. Over the next few years, Hollyanne continued her pattern of running away from home and becoming less responsive to the medical treatment she was receiving for her emotional problems. Her mother Sally said that Hollyanne needed to be watched at all times or she absconded from home constantly. Hollyanne's family tried desperately to make sure they gave her all the help possible. The last time she saw her daughter alive was June 10th, 1980, while they were on their way to a counseling center. Hollyanne began to grow agitated, and while her mother drove, she started to have an outburst and tried opening the door as her mother drove. Sally pulled the car over to the side of the road to reason with Hollyanne, who immediately walked away. Despite trying to pull her back, Sally could not hold on to her daughter. Sally immediately returned home and called the Cherry Hill police to report Hollyanne missing. They provided assistance by stopping several girls who looked like Hollyanne, but it was too late. She had already made her way out of town. A month later, they received a letter from Hollyanne addressed from Sacramento. According to the letter, Hollyanne said she was living with 2 guys and told her parents not to think of her anymore. A trace of the address led them nowhere. It was then they reported her missing and had her name and profile uploaded to the missing persons database. Little did they know her details were accidentally erased from the system. The Cilia family turned to other missing persons networks and Social Security to see if Holly had somehow turned up somewhere on their radars. For years, her family waited for answers. I just kept hoping she would show up one day with grandchildren. But with each year, I'd lose a little hope, said Sally. After 12 years of holding out hope, the Cilia family had finally found Hollyanne, and in a way received the closure they needed. My daughter said to me, "Mom, Holly gave us 12 years to get used to this," said Sally. With each year, we lost a little hope. In a way, knowing what happened to her is some kind of relief, she said. Hollyanne's remains were flown back to New Jersey from California for her final burial in 1992. Sally remarked that it would be the first and last time Hollyanne would be on a plane. She could never wait for a plane. She either hitchhiked or took a bus. When they send her body home, it will be the first time she was ever on a plane. And the last. Investigators now had a name for the victim and worked with Hollyanne's family to find answers to her murder. Having not heard from her in over 12 years, they could offer no new information that would help the case. They were back to square one. No new leads meant no moving forward with the investigation. The case went cold again. As the case sat cold, the family began looking at the new technology that was being introduced to solve cold cases. In 2021, Hollyanne's sisters approached the Solano County Sheriff's Office to find out if it was possible to retest all the biological evidence that was collected from the crime scene and Hollyanne's body. The Sheriff's Office reviewed the case and resubmitted the evidence. Fortunately, the evidence was preserved properly. Advancements in technology allowed for the biological material to be tested despite how old the samples were. The DNA samples were sent to the Serological Research Institute, who were able to discover a foreign DNA profile. The lab results confirmed that the foreign DNA found on several pieces of evidence was that of a male. With a new DNA profile, officials submitted their new findings to the San Mateo Crime Lab in California. They soon discovered that the DNA profile was already on their system and belonged to a man already doing serious time in prison, Herman Lee Hobbs. 76-year-old Herman Lee Hobbs was already serving time at the Valley State Prison in Cilia. Hobbs had lived in Sacramento and worked as a mechanic. Reports suggest that he was married to a woman named Louise Hobbs and had children with her. Hobbs was alleged to have been a drug user and also involved in manufacturing methamphetamine for his own use. There is not much information regarding his personal life, but Hobbs' criminal history is extensive and disturbing. In 1969, at age 22, Hobbs was apprehended after leading police on a wild car chase following a spate of robberies in Sacramento. He admitted to being responsible for more than a dozen robberies and agreed to plead guilty to being the serial burglar. However, during his sentencing, he attempted to escape from the courtroom and had to be tackled and subdued by courthouse officers. He was released in 1975 after serving just 5 years, but the worst was still to come. In the year 2000, Hobbs' criminal career came to a crashing end. He was convicted of assaulting a female from Yuba County, California. Following his conviction, his own daughter and niece came forward with a tip that Hobbs may be responsible for numerous fatal attacks between 1975 and 2000. Investigators looked back at several cold cases and were able to identify Hobbs' movement since his release. In January 1975, 13-year-old Terry Pata had left school early after complaining of feeling sick with a headache. She never made it home. Her body was found 9 days later, stuffed in a drain pipe along the route she normally took home. She had been fatally wounded with a knife. Investigators discovered that Hobbs had moved to Rio Linda in 1975 and lived only a block away from Terry's home. With Hobbs' DNA already on file, they tested it against the evidence from Terry's murder and found a positive match. Hobbs was already serving a lengthy sentence for the Yuba County case from 2000. He pleaded no contest to Terry's murder and was given another sentence of 25 years to life. Another cold case resurfaced following Hobbs' arrest. In the year 2000, loggers working near the Yuba County foothills discovered the skull of a woman. The remains were sent off to an anthropology lab in California for DNA testing. The results proved that the skull belonged to 29-year-old Brenda Ann Tucker, who was reported missing in May 1994. Her clothes were found neatly folded by a creek in the Rackerby area, and her car was discovered in a parking lot of a Brownsville market. Brenda was classified as missing until December 2000. After the results from the autopsy, it was proved that it was a gunshot to the back of her head that killed her. Furthermore, witnesses came forward after the discovery, claiming that Brenda was murdered. The case went to trial while Hobbs was serving his sentence for Terry's murder. Yuba County Detective Sergeant Phil Spadini testified at the trial. In court, he said that witnesses claimed to have seen Brenda leave Hobbs' residence shortly before he too was seen leaving. He also said the clothing belonging to Brenda was found about a half a mile from the home he shared with his wife Louise in 1994 and included a towel from Hobbs' own home. He further added that Brenda's remains were found a short distance from where Hobbs lived in 1984. Spadini also brought forth 2 calls received from women in Yuba County that alleged Hobbs assaulted them, one of which said her assault occurred near the woods where Brenda's remains were found. Brenda's family said that Hobbs knew them well and was often a house guest during the 1990s. DNA found on the black pants that Brenda was last seen wearing proved to be a match to Hobbs. But on September 17, 2002, during his arraignment, a judge dismissed the case, stating that there was insufficient evidence to link Hobbs to Brenda's murder. Investigators were also looking into a possible link between Herman Lee Hobbs and the disappearance of 35-year-old Jennifer Lynn Wallace from Dobbins in Yuba County. Jennifer was reported missing by her estranged husband in November 1997, after failing to meet him as scheduled. In 2023, Hobbs' name resurfaced after DNA found at the Holly and Campilia crime scene matched his own during the reinvestigation of the case. A warrant was issued to obtain Hobbs' DNA in order to confirm a direct match. It proved to be a positive match to the male DNA profile found on the evidence. Hobbs was charged and arrested on February 24, 2023 for the murder of Holly and Campilia. He was transferred from the state prison to Solano County Jail. He is being held without bail and on a state prisoner hold. Hobbs is set to be arraigned on March 13, 2023 in the Solano County Superior Court in Fairfield. Investigators are currently working on investigating 5 other cases that may be linked to Herman Lee Hobbs. Following the confirmation of Hobbs' involvement in the death of Holly and Campilia, the Sheriff's Department released a statement thanking the Campilia family and the investigators working the case. We are grateful to the Campilia family for their patience and assistance, to the labs whose new technology allowed additional testing of older evidence, and to the staff who worked tirelessly to help bring closure to a lifetime of waiting, they said in a statement. Sadly, Holly and Sister Karen died aged 47 on June 11, 2009 from natural causes. On July 3, 2016, her mother Sally Campilia also died at age 83 without knowing who was responsible for her daughter's murder. The Solano County Sheriff's Office said that detectives are still working with other agencies in Northern California to identify and possibly link Hobbs to other cold cases and possible victims. For investigators who take on the challenge of cold cases, it becomes a job motivated by determination, dedication, and a responsibility to the families of the victims to see a case through to the end, no matter how many years it takes to find answers. In the case of Hollyanne Campilia, her family's need for answers may be able to bring closure to many other families who may have lost loved ones to the evil motives of Herman Lee Hobbs. Do you think Herman Lee Hobbs could be responsible for more cold cases in the Yuba County area? Laurel was born on the 24th of May in 1958 to Richard Mitchell and Wilma Mitchell in the town of North Webster. She had an older brother named Bruce Mitchell and a little sister named Sarah Mitchell, whom she was 5 years older than. Despite the occasional sibling rivalry, Laura and her siblings had a tight-knit bond that only grew stronger with time, where her warm smile and friendly nature won over the hearts of everyone she met. One of her most endearing qualities was her unwavering kindness and caring nature. She had a heart of gold and always went out of her way to help others and make them feel loved. The neighborhood children were particularly fond of Laurel, and it wasn't uncommon to see her surrounded by young children all clamoring for her attention and affection. Laurel had many talents, but perhaps her greatest passion was music. From a young age, she had a natural gift for singing, and so it was no surprise that she was a key member of the local church choir. But Laurel's love for music didn't stop there. She was also an accomplished dancer who honed her skills by taking lessons at a local studio. For Laurel, music and dance were more than just hobbies. They were a way of life. They gave her a sense of purpose and fulfillment that nothing else could match, and she poured her heart and soul into every performance, no matter how big or small. At the age of 17, Laurel was set to begin her senior year at Wawasee High School. However, before the new school year began, she decided to take up a job at the Cokesbury Inn, a small restaurant located in Epworth Forest. For her, working at the restaurant was a perfect opportunity to gain valuable experience while earning some extra money. She was determined to make the most of every moment, and with this attitude, she threw herself into the job with all the energy and enthusiasm she could muster. In no time, she had become a favorite among the staff and the customers. By 1975, Laurel was living life to the fullest. Friends she loved spending time with and a bright future ahead of her. But unbeknownst to her, fate had other plans. As the sun rose on August 6, 1975, the Mitchell family began their day, unaware that a life-changing tragedy was waiting just around the corner. Laurel, Sarah, and a friend of Laurel's who was staying over with the family got up early and eagerly tackled their morning chores. Bruce, the elder brother, was not home at the time because he was already married and serving in the Army in California. Soon, Richard and Wilma left for their respective workplaces after bidding their daughters goodbye. By mid-afternoon, Laurel also set off for work. She arrived at the Cokesbury Inn in time for her shift, ready to take on the day with a smile on her face. As she greeted customers and went about her duties, time seemed to fly by. Before she knew it, the clock struck 10 p.m., signaling the end of her shift. Earlier that day, she had made plans to meet up with some of her friends at Adventureland, a popular amusement park located just half a mile away from her workplace. And so, when a coworker offered to drive her home after work, she politely declined. At around 10:15 p.m., Laurel said her goodbyes and stepped out of the bustling inn. The night was cool and quiet, with only the sound of crickets chirping in the background. The anticipation of spending a thrilling evening with her friends kept her energized as she walked towards Adventureland. As she walked away from the inn, she was swallowed by the darkness, never to be seen alive again. Meanwhile, Laurel's parents were oblivious that something bad had happened and believed that she was just out having a good time with her friends. Her friends, on the other hand, assumed that she had gone home after work since she did not show up. For some reason, they also decided to change their plans and headed over to a county fair in Warsaw instead of the amusement park. At around midnight, Laurel's friend returned to Richard and Wilma's home. She had been part of the group Laurel was supposed to meet up with. Wondering about Laurel's absence, the friend's shock turned to alarm when she realized she had never made it home. The friend then explained to Laurel's parents how the night had gone and how Laurel had never shown up for the planned outing. Their hearts sank after they heard all that Laurel's friend had to say. They knew in their gut that something was amiss. Laurel was always responsible and would never stay out past curfew without letting them know. Both Richard and Wilma exchanged worried glances, trying to think of what to do next. They decided to give it some time and wait for Laurel to return home. But as the minutes turned to hours, their anxiety grew and they knew they couldn't just sit and wait any longer. Something had to be done. They called the police and reported that Laurel was missing. The dispatcher took their information and promised to send a unit out to their home to take a report. As the sun began to rise and the night turned to dawn, news of Laurel's disappearance spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Concerned neighbors and friends gathered together to search for her by combing through the woods and checking roadsides. Back at home, Laurel was found dead. Laurel's younger sister Sarah woke up and was deeply upset when she discovered that her sister was not at home. Although she was supposed to attend a softball practice that morning, she was in no mood to do so. Her parents, however, urged her to go, and so she left home with a heavy heart. That same morning around 10:30 a.m., a fisherman named Glenn Dixon and his son Hager set out on the Elkhart River hoping to catch some fish. The river was about 15 miles away from Laurel's place of work. As the fisherman and his son were about to begin fishing, they suddenly spotted a fully clothed body floating in the water. They approached it, and upon closer inspection, they realized that it was a dead body that had likely been floating for a while. It was a shocking discovery and a gruesome start to their day. The fisherman and his son contacted the authorities, and soon the once peaceful riverbank was swarming with police officers. Everyone was determined to find out the identity of the victim and what had happened to her. The air was tense with anticipation, and after what seemed like an eternity, the officers finally discovered that the victim was none other than Laurel, the young teenager who had been reported missing by her distraught parents just hours earlier. Soon after, her body was taken away for an autopsy. A few moments after the discovery of the body, a convoy of police vehicles pulled up outside Laurel's parents' home. Richard and Wilma were anxiously waiting for any news of their daughter's whereabouts, but they were not prepared for the news that was about to be delivered to them. As the officers told them what had happened, Richard's eyes filled with tears, and Wilma as well was inconsolable. When Sarah arrived home from her softball practice not too long after, she could sense that something was not right. She found it strange that there were multiple police vehicles in the driveway. With a growing sense of unease, she hurried inside to find her parents in tears. The look on their faces made her heart drop. With a shaky voice, her father broke the devastating news that her beloved sister, Laurel, was dead. From that moment, Sarah's world would never be the same again. Days after Laurel's body was discovered, the results of her autopsy were released. The report stated that she had died by drowning, but there were no apparent signs of trauma aside from bruises on her hands and shoulder. To make matters worse, the report also revealed that she had been sexually abused. The news sent shockwaves throughout the town, and people began to question who could have committed such a heinous act. An investigation was immediately launched by the authorities, and they worked tirelessly to solve the mystery surrounding Laurel's tragic end. With many questions unanswered, detectives began to conduct interviews with potential witnesses. One such witness, a man named Frank Overmeyer, came forward and shared a revelation. He claimed that on the night of Laurel's disappearance, he heard what sounded like the trunk of a car being slammed shut. He suspected that the vehicle in question was an Oldsmobile. This statement by the witness would not make much sense to detectives until several years later. Now, at the time of Laurel's death, detectives collected and stored the clothing and belongings from her body. These included a silver necklace, one earring, shoes, undergarments, a sweatshirt, and blue jeans that were unzipped and unbuttoned. Unfortunately, due to the lack of technology at the time, there was little that could be done with the clothing. However, it was only a matter of time before advancements in forensic technology would breathe new life into the investigation. Laurel's funeral was held at a large church in the heart of the town, and it was attended by an enormous crowd of well-wishers, friends and family members who had come to pay their respects to the young woman, who had been taken from them far too soon. "I don't remember the sermon at all," Sarah said. "I just remember sitting between my dad and my brother, and they were both squeezing my hand so hard." The investigation into Laurel's death intensified after her funeral, with detectives from multiple state and local agencies working round the clock to solve the case. They combed through evidence and interviewed many more individuals, but all their efforts were in vain. No one could figure out how Laurel had met her end, and her family was left in the dark with no answers. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the case slowly faded from the headlines and went cold. But for Laurel's family and friends, the pain of her loss remained. In 2007, Indiana State Police Captain Kevin Smith was assigned as the lead investigator on Laurel's case. He was a man on a mission and was determined to provide the answers that had eluded Laurel's family for so long. The pressure was on, but Captain Smith knew that he would do whatever it took to give Laurel's loved ones the closure they deserved. But despite his best efforts, no new leads or evidence surfaced for several years, leaving him and his team frustrated and discouraged. Hope began to dwindle, and the case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Laurel's parents, Richard and Wilma, never stopped working to keep their daughter's case in the public eye, hoping that someone would come forward with information that would lead to an arrest. But as time passed, the couple's health began to deteriorate. In 2012, tragedy struck once again, and they passed away just 4 months apart, without ever seeing justice for Laurel. It was a heartbreaking end for a couple who had dedicated their lives to seeking answers and closure for their daughter. Despite their passing, the memory of Laurel lived on, and her case continued to be investigated by the authorities. In 2013, detectives received a surprising lead. A woman named Renee Sexton stepped forward to provide a piece of vital information. She revealed that when she was only 16 years old, She had attended a party with a man named John Lehman in 1975. During the car ride home, John had made a startling confession to her. He revealed that he and a friend called Fred Bandy had committed a murder. However, he did not disclose any details about the crime they had committed. Detectives were intrigued by this piece of information and believed that it could be related to Laurel's case. In 2014, a year after Renee's account, detectives received another tip, this time from a man named Bill McDonald. Bill had been a high school sophomore in 1975 and claimed to have met Fred at a party shortly after Laurel's death. Fred had allegedly boasted about committing a crime around the area where Laurel's body was later found. This new development made detectives hopeful, and it prompted them to take a closer look at both Fred and Lehman as potential suspects. They dug deep into the two men's past, but their search yielded nothing significant on Lehman. However, this was not the case for Fred. They discovered that he had been in trouble with the law before. He pleaded guilty to abuse and contributing to the delinquency of an individual. It was an unsettling discovery that left the detectives wondering if this was just the tip of the iceberg. They knew they had to keep digging if they were to uncover the truth about Fred's possible involvement in the murder. In 2019, the items of clothing and belongings collected from Laurel's body were taken out of storage and re-examined by Captain Smith. With cutting-edge technology and modern techniques now at their disposal, he was hopeful that they could finally unlock the secrets hidden within these items of evidence. With this, he submitted some of Laurel's clothing to the state laboratory for DNA testing. Forensic scientists worked diligently for several weeks to analyze the evidence and, in the end, their hard work paid off. They were able to produce a male DNA profile found on the clothing. The discovery brought renewed excitement to the case, and detectives couldn't help but wonder if this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. With the help of the DNA profile, Captain Smith and his team were able to eliminate some of the other suspects they had been looking at, and narrowed their search down to only two individuals on their radar, Fred and Lehman. In December 2022, detectives set off on a mission to Fred's residence, which was located in Indiana. They were determined to get a DNA sample from him. Upon their arrival, they were greeted by Fred, who seemed oblivious to the reason for their visit. The detectives took a deep breath and explained to him why they were there. To their surprise, he did not put up any resistance and even offered to provide a DNA swab voluntarily. After the DNA sample was obtained, the detectives thanked Fred for his cooperation and left his house. On January 13th, a long-awaited breakthrough in the case arrived. The DNA analysis on Fred's sample revealed a match that was beyond the detectives' wildest dreams. The probability of him being the source of the DNA found on Laurel's clothing was a staggering 13 billion times higher than anyone else. The detectives were ecstatic with the news, knowing that they were closer than ever to solving the case that had haunted them for nearly 5 decades. Armed with DNA evidence that linked Fred to the crime scene, they quickly obtained a warrant for his arrest. But their work didn't stop there. They knew they needed more evidence to build a solid case against him, and probably Lehman too. So they also secured warrants to search the homes of both men and collect DNA samples from Lehman. Detectives also discovered that Fred had owned and driven a 1971 Oldsmobile at the time of Laurel's murder. With this knowledge, detectives were able to piece together the horrifying sequence of events that possibly led to Laurel's death. They believed that Fred and Lehman had forced her into the car, driven her to the river, and then deliberately drowned her. It was a shocking and disturbing revelation that sent shivers down the spines of everyone involved in the case. On February 6, 2023, a team of detectives arrested both Fred and Lehman at their respective homes, and they were charged with first-degree murder. At the time of their arrest, they were both 67 years of age. When Captain Smith called Laurel's sister Sarah and her brother Bruce to inform them of the arrests of 2 men in connection to their sister's murder, they were surprised. They were grateful for the breakthrough, but also felt a pang of sadness as she wished her parents were alive to witness the moment. On February 28, 2023, both Fred and Lehman appeared in Noble County Court and pleaded not guilty. But the overwhelming evidence against them spoke louder than their words. Both men were then ordered to be locked up without bonds or the possibility of bail at Noble County Jail. They are scheduled to appear for pretrial hearings on April 24, 2023. As for Sarah, Her heart still aches from the loss of her beloved sister, and although she knows that justice will be served, she admits that it may not be enough to ease the pain. "I'm glad they are going to be punished, that they won't be able to hurt anyone else. But she's still dead," Sarah said. The investigation into Laurel's murder spanned over 4 decades, and it was only through advances in technology and dog detective work that justice was finally served. She will always be remembered by those who loved her, and her memory will serve as a reminder of the importance of seeking justice for victims of crime. May she rest in peace. In 1980, 21-year-old Helene Przyczynski was a senior at Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts. She was an active member of the community there and served as the chair of the resident hall council. The only thing important enough to take her away from that community was her dream of becoming a journalist. Just after New Year's Day, she arrived in Colorado for an internship in the news department at KHOW Radio in Denver. She had an aunt and uncle who lived in Englewood, Colorado, and would be staying with her for the duration of her internship. On Wednesday, January 16th, Helene was just 2 weeks into her stay in Colorado. She left work that afternoon as usual and began her commute home. Her new routine was to take bus from Denver to Englewood, getting on the bus at Colfax Avenue and Broadway in Denver, and getting off at the stop at Union Avenue and South Broadway in Englewood. She would walk from the bus stop to her aunt's home, less than 2 miles away. Helene was responsible and punctual, so her aunt knew something was wrong when she failed to arrive at her home that evening. At 10:30 p.m., she called the Englewood Police Department to report Helene missing. They immediately began searching for her, concerned that her disappearance may have been tied to a series of sexual assaults that had recently occurred in the area. The following morning, a woman was driving past a remote field south of Englewood in an area of Douglas County that would soon become the planned suburb of Highlands Ranch. Her children were in the car with her, and they were on their way to a meeting. One of the children told her that they saw someone lying in the field as they drove past it. A road grader operator was nearby, so the woman stopped and asked him to go into the field to see if her child was correct about someone being there. They were. The operator discovered Helene's body lying in the field. Helene was found nude from the waist down, and her autopsy would reveal that she had been sexually assaulted. Helene's hands had been bound behind her, and she had been stabbed in the back 9 times. Her lungs had both collapsed as a result of those injuries, and her cause of death was extensive blood loss. A witness reported seeing Helene get off the bus in Englewood sometime between 5:57 and 6:30 p.m., meaning that she was abducted by her killer during her walk home. Her autopsy estimated that she died sometime between 8 and 10 p.m. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and volunteers from the Arapahoe County Search and Rescue Unit searched the area for clues that morning. They did not find anything, and the effort was called off as snow began to fall. Investigators canvassed the area for more witnesses and used the media to ask for anyone with information to come forward. Their best lead was a witness who saw a man standing by a vehicle near the field where Helene was found at approximately 10:20 p.m. on January 16th. The witness was only able to provide a general description of the man, but after being put under hypnosis, she was able to provide a detailed composite sketch of the man she had seen. That image was circulated, and owners of the type of vehicle she had observed were investigated, but no arrests were made. Without new leads, the case went cold by the of 1981. Helene was posthumously awarded her degree, with honors, by Wheaton College on May 31, 1980. Helene's friends and family helped create a scholarship in Helene's memory, which is awarded to a senior at the college. The school also awards the Helene Przyczynski Leadership Award to a senior dedicated to the Wheaton community, who has enriched the campus environment through contributions to student life and commitments to others, as Helene did during her time there. A major force in keeping Helene's case from being forgotten in the decades following her death was her high school choral group. As a student at Hamilton Wenham Regional High School in Massachusetts, Helene had been a member of the school's singing group, Club Harmony. Other former members of the group have been actively maintaining the scholarship fund Helene's parents initially established in her memory. The scholarship is awarded to a senior at the school who has made a valuable contribution to a drama or musical production. In addition, 3 former members of the group, and Helene's former choir director, traveled to Colorado in 2006 with the goal of trying to move the case forward. They passed out flyers in the area near the bus stop where Helene was last seen and gave media interviews asking for witnesses to come forward. They were also able to meet with investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to inquire about using more advanced DNA technology to finally close the case. They remained involved with the investigation even after returning home, and Colorado detectives would later travel to Massachusetts to meet with them about Helene's case. The case had been reopened in 1998 by a task force with members from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the Englewood Police Department, with hopes that DNA testing would solve it. Semen had been found on Helene's coat, and a DNA profile was developed from it. Unfortunately, when it was run through the FBI's DNA database, no matches were found. Later searches would also fail to identify a match to the DNA from the crime scene. Helene's case was re-examined again in 2013, when the Douglas County Sheriff's Office formed a cold case unit. The unit would look at the case occasionally over the next few years, but no new leads were found. In 2018, the case was revisited again, but this time investigators had a plan to use one of the newest investigative techniques available in the case. They now hoped that genetic genealogy could be a potential means of identifying a suspect. The process would require an exceptional amount of research, investigation, and problem-solving. Dozens of investigators at the state, local, and federal level worked on the case over the course of the next year. The process of using genetic genealogy in the case began in late 2018, when Detective Jason Serbo of the Cold Case Unit at the Douglas County Sheriff's Office submitted the DNA profile from the crime scene to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia. Parabon prepared to be uploaded to GeneMatch, an open-source genetic genealogy site originally designed to help individuals locate distant relatives and construct family trees. The site also has an option that allows users to authorize law enforcement agencies to compare their DNA to samples from unsolved cases. If individuals who are even distantly related to the suspect provide this access, authorities can study their extended family trees to identify potential suspects based on the amount of DNA they share. Parabon's initial findings after running the crime scene DNA through GeneMatch found 2 individuals estimated to be 3 generations removed from Helene's killer based on the amount of DNA they had in common with him, as well as several other individuals who were more distantly related to him. Several of these individuals allowed Detective Serbo access to their family trees and personal genealogy research. Ultimately, Parabon and Detective Serbo came to the conclusion that Helene's killer was most likely the son of a woman named June Estes. They believed she had a total of 4 sons, but were only able to identify 2 of them. Those 2 sons had been 10 and 11 in 1980 and were therefore eliminated as suspects. June Estes led a tumultuous life, using 6 different surnames over the course of her life and living in multiple states. This made trying to identify her other children very difficult. Investigators still tried to find them, but also continued investigating the possibility that the killer fit into the family tree they were constructing somewhere else. As more and more people uploaded their DNA profiles to GeneMatch, the authorities had more and more information to work with. One woman from Georgia named Jessie, who is distantly related to the killer, has publicly detailed the process of being contacted by investigators and asked to assist in the genealogy research they were performing to identify Helene's killer. Jessie was an early listener of the Murder Squad, a podcast launched by investigative journalist Billy Jensen and retired cold case investigator Paul Holes in April of 2019. Jensen and Holes were both connected to the Golden State Killer case, in which a suspect, Joseph James D'Angelo, was famously arrested decades after the last known crime, thanks to genetic genealogy. Jensen helped complete Michelle McNamara's book on the case, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, after her sudden death in 2016, and Holes worked on the case for many years, retiring just prior to D'Angelo's arrest in April of 2018. Jensen and Holes are therefore vocal advocates of the use of genetic genealogy. They also hoped that their podcast could be used to teach their listeners ways to responsibly help solved cases. Since the beginning of the podcast, they have explained how individuals uploading their DNA profiles, obtained through commercial DNA services like Ancestry.com or 23andMe for personal use, to databases such as GeneMatch, and making them available for comparison to law enforcement, could potentially provide important leads in unsolved cases. Jessie had previously had her DNA analyzed through 23andMe. After hearing Jensen and Holmes explain how she could make her DNA available for investigators to compare it to samples from cold cases, she decided to submit her DNA profile to GeneMatch and uploaded it to the database in April of 2019. In early June of 2019, Jessie received an email from Detective Serbo. He told her that he was working on a cold case from 1980 when he ran DNA found at the crime scene through GeneMatch. Jessie's profile came up as one of the very partial matches. He estimated that Jessie and Helene's killer were third cousins. GeneMatch does not make an individual's full DNA profile available to law enforcement. They also only make available the information users choose to share. When someone uploads their DNA profile to the database, they can opt to use their legal name or make a username. Detective Serbo was able to get in contact with Jessie through the email address she provided, but he did not have much other information about her. He would need her to provide him with details about her family so that he could study her extended family and see exactly where it overlapped with the other individuals the unit had identified. While Jessie had submitted her DNA to GeneMatch because she knew it could potentially help in a criminal case, she did not expect anything to ever come of her decision and was surprised when she received this email. Before responding, she used the limited amount of information she had been given to try to determine if such a case actually existed, to verify that the email was genuine. Researching cold cases in Colorado from 1980, she came across Helene's case and determined that it was most likely the case Detective Serbo was investigating. Jessie enlisted the help of a friend to compile her family tree to provide to Detective Serbo. In addition, she had both of her parents, who had also previously used commercial DNA services, upload their profiles to GeneMatch. This allowed investigators to determine that Jessie was related to the suspect through her father's side of the family. Detective Serbo left the sheriff's office to become a senior criminal investigator for the Denver District Attorney's Office in July of 2019. The task of investigating the vast amount of information being gathered from GeneMatch users then went largely to Detective Shannon Jensen. In addition to Parabon Nanolabs, Detective Jensen also worked closely with a Colorado-based company, United Data Connect. She was able to fund this additional genetic genealogy work thanks to funding from Metro Denver Crime Stoppers. Helping Detective Jensen with the investigation was Joan Hanlon, a professional genealogist working for United Data Connect. Detective Jensen had recently hit a dead end with a potential suspect in Arizona, but Ms. Hanlon provided new ideas to keep the investigation moving forward. She helped Detective Jensen identify key family members of individuals who were already cooperating in the investigation, who should have their DNA tested, and began researching different descendant lines. Over several months, other distant relatives were identified and contacted, and certain descendant lines were eliminated from consideration. The work was tedious, but ultimately provided the information needed to finally close Helene's case. Instead of identifying a new potential suspect, Ms. Hanlon's new efforts ultimately brought Detective Jensen back to the original theory genetic genealogy had generated in the case. Thanks to Ms. Hanlon's work, Detective Jensen located a family member who could finally tell her about the two unidentified sons of June Estes. This family member revealed that after June had suffered a nervous breakdown, her husband, William White, had taken her boys away from her. He eventually sent them to live with their uncle Fred. The boys were named William and Curtis White, and the relative was able to provide details like where they had been born and places they had lived. This information allowed Detective Jensen to finally identify the previously unknown sons of June Estes and investigate them as potential suspects. One of the brothers, William White Jr., had an extensive criminal record. Detective Jensen learned that his DNA had been entered into the combined DNA index system in 2010. Since the sample from Helene's coat had been run through that database after 2010 and had not matched to William White, she knew that he was not her suspect. However, she still had his DNA compared to that from the crime scene. In November of 2019, it was confirmed that William White was not the suspect she was looking for, but YSTR analysis, a type of analysis specific to the Y chromosome carried by males, revealed that William and Helene's killer came from the same paternal lineage. The investigation was on the right track. June's other son with William White Sr. had been born Curtis Allen White, but he was using the name James Curtis Clanton by 2019. In 1975, while living under another alias, Curtis White had raped a woman at knife point in Arkansas after gaining entry into her home by asking to use her telephone. He pled guilty to first-degree rape and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. However, he would only serve a fraction of that sentence. After stealing a car while trying to run away from home as a teenager, White had been sent to live at the Southern Christian Home, a children's home in Arkansas. After he was sent to prison in 1975, one of his former counselors from the home got in contact with him and offered to help him get back on his feet. The counselor was now living in Douglas County, Colorado, and offered to let White come live with him, his wife, and 5 children. He also promised to help him get a job. This offer played a major role at White's parole hearing in early 1979. "I want to be paroled because I have people that care about me now and I have adjusted myself," White said at the hearing. Having a support system in the form of a counselor apparently made White a good candidate for parole, and he was released from prison on March 6, 1979, after serving only 4 years of a 30-year sentence. His parole agreement allowed him to move to Colorado to live with his former counselor and assigned him to a parole officer there. White did live with the counselor and his family for a year, as he had assured the court and worked at the landscaping job the counselor had secured for him. This placed him in the area at the time of Helene's murder. White would later move to Englewood and work for a backing company, but he moved back in with the counselor and his family after just a few months. By 1982, he had moved to Florida and changed his name to James Curtis Clanton. He would be married and divorced twice over the years, with the first marriage lasting only 30 days. In 1998, he was arrested for domestic battery in Palm Beach County. His mugshot from this arrest would be the first image investigators in Colorado would see of him. It bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch of the suspect developed back in 1980. While Clanton's criminal history, resemblance to the sketch, and place within the family tree investigators had constructed made him look like a promising suspect, these details by no means proved that he killed Helene. In order to eliminate or confirm him as the suspect, investigators would need to test his DNA, which was not in any database. They therefore began the process of trying to surreptitiously collect a DNA sample from him to test against the DNA from the crime scene. Detectives Tim Vinot and Troy Crosswhite of the Douglas County Sheriff's Office were assigned to try to get a sample from Clanton. They spent the week of Thanksgiving, 2019, surveilling Clanton, following him around Lake Butler, Florida, where the 62-year-old was living and working as a truck driver. Their first attempt to get a sample of his DNA from a discarded milk carton was unsuccessful, so their surveillance continued. On November 30th, they followed Clanton into a bar called the Full House Lounge just before noon. They watched him drink several beers, pouring each bottle into a mug. After Clanton left the establishment, the detectives collected the beer mug from the bartender. It was sent back to Colorado for analysis. The DNA found on the mug was a match to the DNA found at Helene's crime scene. On December 11, 2019, a little more than a month shy of the 40th anniversary of Helene's murder, James Curtis Clanton parked his truck near his home, as was his routine. As he walked away from it, he was arrested. With the assistance of the Union County Sheriff's Office, Clanton was taken into custody without incident and extradited back to Colorado. Clanton was being charged with first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping. He could not be charged with sexual assault because the statute of limitations for that crime had expired. Authorities have so far not connected Clanton to the other sexual assaults committed in the area around the time of Helene's murder. Clanton's arrest was announced at a press conference on December 16, 2019, the same day he appeared in court to be formally advised of the charges against him. Investigators and District Attorney George Brauchler were prepared to take the case to trial. However, at a court hearing on February 21, 2020, Clanton pled guilty to the charges against him. This plea to these specific charges requires that he be sentenced to life in prison. However, because of the statutes in place in 1980 when the crime was committed, he will be able to apply for parole after serving 20 years in prison. As he would be 82 years old at that time, he may not live long enough to even have the opportunity to make such an application. Helene's friends and family are extremely grateful for the work of all the investigators and the tenacity they showed by not giving up on solving Helene's case. Unfortunately, The passage of time between Helene's murder and the arrest of her killer meant that many of her loved ones did not get to see the case solved. In addition to her beloved grandmother, Cilia, all of Helene's immediate family, save for her older sister, Janet Johnson, passed away before Clanton's arrest. Her brother, Chet, passed away in 2009 at the age of 63, and her parents, Henrietta and Chester, passed away within 3 months of each other in 2012. Janet Johnson wants the focus of this case to remain on Helene and her memory. In a statement she released through the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, she described her younger sister as her best friend and a loving relative to her entire family. Hatching up and killed, Helene would have gone on to do great things. "There has not been a day that goes by that we haven't missed her," Johnson said in the statement. "The detectives and everyone else who helped make this day happen are my heroes." On Friday, May 24, 1957, Emmanuel Akinyemi was working at the Gloucester Road Underground Station in London. As a foreman, his job included taking tickets and operating the lift. At 10:20 p.m., he heard someone running up the emergency staircase. If someone were fast enough, they could make it up the stairs before the lift got back up to street level and avoid the lift attendant and paying their fare. Then, Emmanuel heard a woman yelling, "Bandit! Bandit!" He had just brought the lift down to the eastbound platform and saw a tall, white-haired woman slowly stumbling towards the lift, clutching her chest. When he asked her about the bandits, she replied, "I have been knifed." It was then that Emmanuel noticed the blood seeping through the woman's jacket down her left side. Emmanuel quickly helped the woman onto the lift and began bringing her up to street level. He asked her where the bandit was, and she told him she did not know. Authorities would later come to the conclusion that the person Emmanuel had heard on the emergency staircase was the culprit making his escape. The woman was already too weak from blood loss to speak much more. Once the lift reached the street level, Emmanuel left the woman with the station inspector and ran to call for help from a nearby public phone. Police Constable Ron Sherfield of the Metropolitan Police happened to be passing by outside of the station and was called in to help. He stayed with the woman as she was transported to St. Mary Abbott's Hospital, and she spoke her final, labored words to him, "I was on the platform, then stabbed." The woman passed away not long after she arrived at St. Mary Abbott's, just after midnight on May 25th. The woman was 73-year-old Countess Teresa Lubienska. The native of Poland had been living in London since the end of the Second World War. She had spent the night of May 24th having dinner with friends at their home in Florence Road, Ealing. She had left the gathering with Father Krzyzanowski, a Polish priest. They boarded the Piccadilly line at Ealing Common and rode together until Father Krzyzanowski disembarked at Earl's Court. The Countess had remained on the train until it reached the next station, Gloucester Road. A post-mortem examination revealed that the Countess had been stabbed 5 times by her killer. 2 of the wounds had pierced her heart. The other 3 wounds were in her chest, stomach, and back. The weapon used was a very small knife, no more than 2 inches long. The Countess had been born Teresa Skarżynska on April 18, 1884, in southeastern Poland. She came from a noble family and was educated at a prestigious all-girls Catholic boarding school in Ukraine. She acquired her title upon her marriage to Count Edward Lubinski in 1902. Following her marriage, she went to live on her husband's family estate and became an active member of the Polish Red Cross. She and her husband had 2 children, a son Stanislaw, born in 1906, and a daughter, Isabella, born in 1910. During the political upheaval that followed the 1918 Bolshevik Revolution, Count Lubinski was stabbed to death and the family estate was seized. The Countess and her children then fled to Warsaw. Her son Stanislaw chose to go into the military and graduated from Cavalry Officer Cadet School in 1928, ranked 2nd in his class of 50 cadets. He rose to the rank of captain in 1936 and was killed in September of 1939 as he fought during the German invasion of Poland. Perhaps as a way to cope with her grief, Countess Lubienska became an active member of the Polish resistance against the Nazis and German occupation. She helped find aid for civilians suffering under the occupation, and her apartment was one of the earliest places where the secret meetings of the Polish resistance were held. In 1942, she was reported to Nazi officials who searched her apartment and found the escaped prisoners she had been hiding there. The Countess was arrested and sent to Pauillac prison for her initial interrogation. From there, she was sent to Auschwitz, where her prisoner number for 4747 was tattooed on her arm. She was then sent on to Ravensbrück, where she was sentenced to death. Her sentence was commuted at the last minute due to the intervention of the Swedish Red Cross. Countess Lubienska would remain at Ravensbrück as a political prisoner for over 2 years, during which time she was tortured and became gravely ill. Despite all this, she remained serene and strong, according to those held with her. Instead of focusing on her own suffering, she instead tried to help her fellow prisoners, to whom she showed great kindness. She earned the nickname the White Angel during her time in the camp for her efforts. The Countess was able to survive in the camp until she was finally released and then fled to London, where she was eventually reunited with her daughter. She lived modestly in a one-room flat in Cornwall Gardens, Kensington, and dedicated her life to helping other displaced persons and concentration camp survivors. She founded and was the chair of the London Association of Polish Ex-Political Prisoners in Germany. Her work over the years following the war had put her in contact with more than 1,000 fellow Poles now living in England and 5,000 Poles scattered throughout the rest of the United Kingdom and Europe. Following the Countess' death, the General Secretary of the Federation of Polish Exiles in London, Mr. T. Hesiak, said, "This is a great shock and loss to the Polish community in London." The Countess was very well known and very well esteemed throughout Poland and by every Pole in this country. She was a woman of much bravery, very religious, and always the champion of the poor. On Sunday, May 26th, more than 3,000 Polish exiles attended Mass at Brompton Oratory, where special prayers were offered for the Countess, described by the officiating priest as a devout and brave daughter of Poland. Following the Mass, more than 300 people remained in a private chapel, lighting candles before an image of Our Lady of Czestochowa and kneeling in prayer until early evening on behalf of the Countess and her memory. The Countess' political and social activism was, of course, immediately considered as a potential motive in her murder. Her daughter, Isabella, was convinced that the crime had a political motive. It is possible that her killer could have held extreme political views and disagreed with the Countess' opposition to the Nazi Party or her work on behalf of displaced persons. A popular theory in the Polish community at the time was that Countess Lubinska had been murdered by a Soviet agent or by a treacherous member of the Polish community now working for the Soviets. However, the small knife used in the murder seemed like an improvised weapon, and the well-lit platform full of witnesses was an unlikely location for a planned assassination. A more popular theory early on in the investigation held that the Countess had run into someone she recognized from her time with the Polish resistance on the platform. She perhaps saw someone from Poland who had cooperated with the Germans during the occupation. This theoretical person may have felt it necessary to kill the Countess on the spot to prevent her from exposing their secret. Supporting this theory was the fact that the Countess had a remarkable ability to remember faces. She could remember people with ease, even though she knew so many people as a result of her work. Countess Lubinska's activism and ties to the war, of course, may also have been purely coincidental, and she may have been the victim of a random crime, such as robbery. There was no indication that someone had tried to grab her handbag, but she could have been killed by a panicked thief following a botched attempt to steal from her. Those who knew the Countess believed that she would have fought back against anyone trying to rob her. The Countess' repeated use of the term bandit following her attack would seem to support this theory. A bandit is generally defined as someone who steals or plunders. However, the Countess was known to use the term outside of its widely accepted definition. Speaking at the inquest into the Countess' death, one of her family members, Adam Antony Bilansky, testified that she used to say that word very often, describing some hooligans. "I remember it very well. Speaking about some people who are drinking too much, making a noise, she used it very often." This ties into another possible motive in the case. While Countess Lubinska was a champion of the poor and lived modestly after the war, her younger years as a member of a noble family still influenced some of her views. She had very strong opinions about proper behavior and was not afraid to voice them. She disapproved of rowdiness, vulgarity, and drunkenness, and expected others to behave with the same sense of propriety she did. According to a station porter, there had been a group of young people at horseplay on the platform shortly before the Countess arrived there. She may have reprimanded them for what she considered misbehavior and been killed in a subsequent argument. Police were never able to determine the motive in the murder because they were never able to identify the killer. This was not due to a lack of effort, however. The exact train the Countess had been on was identified, and the time of her arrival at the station was placed at exactly 10:19 p.m. The driver and guard on the train were interviewed, but could not provide any useful information. More than 200 trains on the Piccadilly line were examined. Dozens of police officers searched the various sections of the station, as well as the surrounding tunnels, thinking that the murder weapon may have been discarded. It was never found, despite the fact that for several months, any knife found anywhere along the underground was turned over to the police for examination. Photographers and fingerprint experts were on the scene quickly after the murder and worked alongside police officers throughout the night. The only blood evidence left at the scene was in and near the lift, so the exact location in the station where the Countess was stabbed could not be identified. Police were able to determine that 17 people had left the station around the time the Countess was killed, but had trouble tracking them down. They identified 2 individuals in particular they believed may have witnessed the crime, as they were seen running from the platform shortly after the Countess was stabbed. One of them was a smartly dressed woman, wearing a black coat and red high-heeled shoes. She was carrying a black handbag, had black hair, and was around 20 years of age. The other potential witness was a fair-haired man with a medium build, estimated to be 27 years old. He was clean-shaven and approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall. Neither of these witnesses came forward, and no one could identify them to police. The police therefore began going door to door in the area, looking for people who had been at or near the station that night. More than 2,000 homes were visited as a part of this effort. In the 3 months following the murder, more than 18,000 people, living locally and abroad, were interviewed in connection to the case. Despite this extensive effort, no arrests were ever made in the case. The formal inquest into Countess Lubienska's death was held on August 19, 1957. The jury returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. More than 60 years later, the identity of that person or persons still remains unknown. Funeral services were held for Countess Lubienska on June 1, 1957 at Brompton Oratory, and she was buried at Brompton Cemetery. The Polish government in exile posthumously awarded her the Golden Cross of Merit with Swords, an award given for wartime acts of valor and bravery under perilous circumstances, but not during combat. While Countess Lubienska's legacy has lived on in the community she so loved, so has the mystery of who ended her extraordinary life. Andre Price Jr. was a natural athlete who earned numerous trophies playing basketball, baseball, and bowling. His main passion was baseball. He attended several baseball camps and lettered in the sport at Montbello High School in Denver, Colorado. He graduated high school in 1992 and tried out for several minor league baseball teams, although he was never signed to any of them. Andre became a father to a daughter named Desiree around the time he graduated high school and worked tirelessly both to take care of her and to provide for her. In addition to attending school at Aurora Community College with plans to study psychology and real estate, Andre worked for Denver Public Schools as an apprentice electrician, as well as for his father, working on cars at the car lot he owned. On the evening of June 27, 1995, Andre asked his mother, Suzanne, if she could watch 3-year-old Desiree. He wanted to go visit his cousin, 22-year-old Jerry Baker. She agreed, under the condition that Andre return home at 10 p.m. because she had to go to work the following morning. At 9:50 that night, Andre and Jerry were outside Jerry's home in the 5500 block of Yuba Way in Denver's Montbello neighborhood. A group of men, between 2 and 4 depending on the account, walked up the street and approached the two cousins. Shortly thereafter, shots rang out. Jerry was shot in the neck but survived the injury. Andre was not as lucky. He was shot 7 times in the back and pronounced dead after he arrived at the hospital. He was just 21 years old. It has long been theorized that there are witnesses with information in the case who have been too afraid to come forward. One theory in the case is that Andre's cousin, Jerry, was the intended victim that night, as he had recently testified at a murder trial. The defendant in that case was found guilty. Even if Andre's death is not tied to this criminal case, his killers do appear to have intimidated members of the community into inaction based on the lack of information coming into the authorities and problems Andre's family has encountered while asking for help in the case. Andre's mother, Suzanne, despite her grief at the loss of her son, began working on the case herself almost immediately. She held fundraisers to start a fund for a reward. She posted flyers. She knocked on doors in the neighborhood and asked people if they had seen anything. Her efforts angered someone in the community, and her car windows were smashed in while the car was parked in front of her house. Suzanne was not deterred, however. "It has never scared me. It only made me stronger," she said in 2011. Andre's case is still being pursued by the Denver Police Department's Cold Case Investigative Unit, largely due to the efforts of Suzanne Price. This case landed on my desk because the mom is keeping it very much alive. She's actively invested in trying to find out who's responsible for the death of her son, Detective Carrie Johnson said in 2019. Detective Johnson also said that there is evidence in the case that can be retested with more advanced methods, but witnesses will need to come forward to identify suspects in the case in order for it to finally be solved. Suzanne worked as an aircraft appearance coordinator for Frontier Airlines, supervising one of the teams that cleans the airline's planes at the Denver airport. In 2010, she appeared on an episode of the CBS show Undercover Boss, unknowingly training the airline's CEO, Brian Bedford, on how to quickly clean a plane in between flights. Bedford was both impressed by Suzanne's work and personality and moved by Andre's story. As a result, he offered to name an aircraft after Andre. Suzanne was also allowed to choose the animal that appeared on the plane's tail. She chose an antelope because, like Andre, it was very fast. The plane bearing Andre's name was dedicated on April 1st, 2011. Suzanne cleaned the plane several weeks later on Mother's Day, making sure that it was the cleanest plane in the fleet. Suzanne retired at the end of 2019, with plans to dedicate the time she previously spent working to investigating her son's case. On February 3, 1972, in Boone, North Carolina, there was a snowstorm coming. Bryce Durham, who was 51 years old, went to a Rotary meeting where hardly anyone came because of the bad weather. Afterward, he went to pick up his wife, Virginia, from their Buick car dealership. Their 18-year-old son, Bobby, was with them and needed a ride home. Bryce decided to leave their car at the dealership and borrow a more suitable vehicle for driving safely in the snow. Later that evening, their oldest child, Ginny Hall, who lived with her husband about 4 miles away, was watching the Winter Olympics with her husband, Troy, when they received a strange call. It had been Troy who answered, and he wasn't able to discern what the caller was saying, but he told Ginny it sounded like her mother. They tried to call back, but the line was busy. They became increasingly concerned and eventually decided to drive over to their house and check on them. They went out and tried to start their car, but it wouldn't start. They knocked on the door of their neighbor, who was a retired private detective who offered to drive them. Ginny stayed in the car, while Troy and the neighbor went into the house. Immediately, they knew something wasn't right. The house had been ransacked. Troy saw that the telephone had been ripped from the wall, and the TV was still on in the living room. They also heard the sound of running water coming from the bathroom, but other than that, the house was silent. The bodies of Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby were discovered in the bathroom. Troy ran to a neighbor's house where he called the police and an investigation began immediately. The call from the Durham's house had come in around 10:30 p.m. with Ginny and Troy arriving about 15 minutes later. Officers arrived shortly after. The vehicle that Bryce had borrowed was missing from the driveway. Neighbors reported seeing the vehicle leaving the Durham house around 10:30. The vehicle was recovered several hours later, abandoned with the doors closed, engine running, and the wipers still going. The vehicle also contains stolen items from the house, indicating to officers that robbery hadn't been the primary motive in the attack. No one could understand why the family had been targeted. They had moved to Boone 18 months prior from a neighboring county, and they opened up their dealership. Everyone who knew them described them as quiet, keeping to themselves, but hardworking. No one knew of anything that could explain why they had been murdered. An autopsy was done, and it was determined that Bryce and Bobby had been drowned, and Virginia had been strangled. Nothing of value was taken from the home. Cash and jewelry had been left behind. Detectives had 4 suspects in mind and interrogated them several times, but there was no evidence tying them to the crimes and they had to be released. Without further evidence, the case went cold for 50 years. Then, in 2019, a tip was called into the Watauga County Sheriff's Office. A man named Shane Burt believed he had information that his father had been involved in the Durham case. His father, Billy Sunday Burt, who was already incarcerated in Georgia, had told him that he had been involved in a family murder in North Carolina, and also revealed a snowstorm had almost caused them to be caught. His father had passed in 2017, and he wanted to pass on the information in case it would help the case. Burt also implicated a man named Billy Wayne Davis as having been involved. So police looked him up and discovered he was also incarcerated in Georgia. They discovered Burt and Davis had been involved in a Georgia mob. Davis confirmed that, along with Burt, Bobby Jean Gaddis and Charles David Reed had also been involved. Davis, now 81, and the only survivor, said that he had only acted as the getaway driver and that the others had murdered the family. Davis said that they had murdered them because there had been a hit out on Bryce and they were just fulfilling the contract, but he said he didn't know why a hit had been placed or why Bryce had been wanted by a local mafia. "We are confident that we now know who committed these crimes," Sheriff Hagman said in the statement. "This is a much-needed turning point for the Durham case. Though they don't believe they will ever know who hired the men to kill the Durhams, they are confident they know who did it and have closed the case after 5 decades. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. It was on June 5, 1995 in Atlanta, Georgia, when 14-year-old Nicole Smith was walking to school with her little sister. Early in on the walk, Nicole realized she forgot something she needed for class and turned around and headed back towards her house. To save a little time, Nicole cut through a small wooded area that she normally didn't walk through alone. It was in this shortcut that a man confronted her, brutally assaulted her, and shot her twice in the face. Nicole's body was found later that day, and a massive investigation followed to find the man who killed her. A DNA profile was established in 1995, but detectives were never able to find the person it belonged to. Detectives collected over 50 blood samples from suspects and compared them to the DNA of the killer, but none were a match. Without further evidence, the case went cold. In 2002, the case was reopened and worked on for 2 years, but again, no new leads were found. In 2004, their killer had attacked another young teenager, 9 years after Nicole's murder. The victim was 13, and this victim survived the attack and had been able to work with a sketch artist to generate the first composite image of their suspect. Hundreds of persons of interest were interviewed. The case was even aired on national television, being featured on America's Most Wanted. But again, without any new leads, the case went cold. With the increase in genetic genealogy being used to solve cold cases, Atlanta detectives thought this case had a good chance at being solved. They sent out samples in 2021, and just before Christmas, they were notified that they had a match. The man they had been looking for 26 years was 49-year-old Kelvin Arnold. Arnold had never been a suspect in either investigation and was not known to the victims, nor did he have a criminal history. They were disappointed to discover that Arnold would never be able to be arrested, as he had died in August of 2021 of liver and kidney failure. Officials are looking to see if there are any more victims connected to Arnold, but said in a statement that the state of Georgia has a significant backlog of untested sexual assault kits, and it may take time. This is kind of an odd cold case, and I'm not even sure if it was a cold case or more of a forgotten case. It was the early morning hours of July 17, 2007, in Thonotosassa, Florida, when a 911 call came in. The caller was identified as Jonathan Burns, and he claimed that he had been attacked by one of his tenants. He said that he was suffering multiple stab wounds. Twyna Ottman had been killed in self-defense. The detectives arrived on the scene and found the 41-year-old victim located outside her home. She was deceased and had a large laceration on her neck, as well as several wounds on her chest. Burns, who was 43 at the time, also had 2 wounds to the abdomen. Burns was taken to the hospital to have his wounds treated, and it was also noted that he had several scratch marks on his hands and had several small cuts on his fingers. During the investigation, officers had discovered a trail of blood that led to the area behind Burns' home. There, they also found a bloody knife in a garbage bin and later determined it had been Burns' DNA. They also discovered that Burns' blood was not found anywhere near Toinia's body, nor was her DNA found on the knife. They also discovered that Tanya was disabled and used a walker and wheelchair to get around. Though she could stand, she would have had great difficulty attacking someone without her mobility aids, and someone able-bodied could easily have gotten away from her. This is where it kind of gets strange. The evidence was shown to the state attorney, who concluded there wasn't enough evidence to charge Burns with murder, and the investigation just stopped. Burns wasn't interrogated or even challenged on his series of events. Neighbors weren't interviewed, it just stopped, and officers were directed elsewhere. Fast forward to 15 years later, when the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit decided to reopen this case. On January 14th, they went back to Jonathan Burns and interviewed him about the events that had occurred. When Toinja had been stabbed to death, Burns told detectives that he had been drinking heavily that night and Toinja had started yelling at him while he was doing his closing procedure for the common areas of the mobile home park they lived on. Toinja had been a tenant for a long time and he claimed he walked over to talk to her and she just stabbed him. When other tenants of the park learned that detectives had come by to interview Burns, they started calling into the sheriff's office to share information. Several witnesses claimed that in the days following Toinia's death, Burns was drunk and had admitted to doing something wrong and needing to face it. Another person stated that Burns had told them that Toinia had gotten what she deserved and that he would do it again if given the chance. A third person said that when they asked Burns how he had been stabbed, he told them that he had stabbed himself in the abdomen so that the self-defense would look legitimate. Burns had written a letter detailing what had actually happened that night. He said that he saw Tanya outside of her home while he was closing up the park for the night. He stated that they got into an argument and then he went home, grabbed a knife from his kitchen and went back to her home. He said that she had tried to go inside, but he stabbed her several times and cut her throat. He then went back home and stabbed himself, and tried to hide the knife before calling 911. The letter was turned over to law enforcement, who were able to validate it with the evidence from the crime scene. When asked why he did it, he just said that he didn't like her. He wanted to hurt her. He said in a statement, "Unfortunately, I killed her. This was a terrible tragedy that I am responsible for. I wish I could change it." Jonathan Burns has not yet been arrested and charged with the murder of Toina Ottman. He will have his first court appearance later this month. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Thomas Brown was a standout student in high school. He was a senior, played football for the state team, acted in the drama club, and served as class president. His sudden disappearance and the discovery of his death have puzzled investigators, who couldn't figure out if he was murdered, had an accident, or took his own life. Thomas grew up in Canadian, Texas, a small community where he was known as kind, reliable, and responsible. His teachers and classmates liked him a lot. Thomas lived with his mom and stepdad, and his older brother Tucker was away at college but came home to visit for Thanksgiving weekend. The day before Thanksgiving, on November 23, 2016, had seemed normal. Around 6 p.m., Thomas went to meet up with some friends. They hung out for a few hours, just driving around, chatting, but eventually they all decided to head home around 11 p.m. Thomas had a midnight curfew and left himself plenty of time to get home. He was seen at 11:28 p.m. at Frank's Oil and Gas, and there was a charge on his debit card for gas. He was driving his red Dodge Durango and was seen one more time at 11:38 p.m., heading in the direction of his house. Thomas's mom, Penny, checked her phone at midnight and thought it was odd that Thomas had missed curfew. It was very unusual for him, and if he knew he was going to be late, he always called or texted to let her know he was on the way home. She waited a little bit longer, but woke her husband up around 12:30 a.m. and told him she was going out to look for Thomas. Tucker was still awake, watching a movie with his friend, and was also enlisted to help search. Their initial concern was that Tom had gotten in an accident, and using separate vehicles, they drove around. Thomas's friends were also called. They confirmed they saw Thomas drive off to go home around 11 p.m. and hadn't heard from him since. They had also been surprised that Thomas hadn't made it home yet. His friend said, "My first thought was that he had just gotten a flat tire. I mean, nothing ever happens in Canadian, nothing terrible. So I was concerned, but I didn't have a huge amount of concern." After searching for 2 hours with no sign of Thomas, Penny called the sheriff's department and reported Thomas missing. A deputy joined the search. Tucker went back to the house where he and his friend had been hanging out, but Thomas wasn't there either. There were several volunteer search parties that morning, all to no avail. Everyone was extremely worried because it was very out of character for Thomas not to come home or contact his parents when he knew they would be concerned. One of the volunteers owned a helicopter sales and service company, and he took one of his choppers up in the air to search for Thomas's car. They found it under a small cluster of trees near the town's water treatment plant. There was no sign of Thomas near the vehicle. It was found unlocked and seemingly abandoned. A costume from a drama production, towels, jumper cables, and the car showed no signs of malfunction. There were, however, several stains that were later determined to be dried blood and a .25 caliber shell casing on the floor of the vehicle. Missing was his wallet, cell phone, keys, and backpack. The news of Thomas's car being discovered postponed many residents' Thanksgiving plans. A huge gathering of volunteers on foot, horseback, and on ATVs were out in full force searching for Thomas. The man with the helicopter also got his son to fly a second helicopter around, and the two of them stayed low to the ground and searched. A tracking dog was also brought in, but the dogs couldn't pick up Thomas's scent anywhere near the vehicle. By the end of the day, authorities were still fairly certain Thomas hadn't left town. CCTV footage around town was checked, and they determined that the Durango had been captured several times in the early morning hours, driving around town. It was last captured heading towards the water treatment plant at 5:56 a.m., driving slowly along the dirt road, parking, and then turning the headlights off. The headlights had been the only lights in the area, and without car lights, it was impossible to determine if it was even Thomas who was driving. Unfortunately, they did not have much more to go on, other than it appeared he had abandoned his vehicle. Local police called in help from surrounding counties and sheriff's departments. The FBI was also contacted, but because there was not enough evidence, the case eventually went cold and the search ended. When it became clear that the authorities were not looking for Thomas anymore, his family hired a private investigator to continue the search. The private investigator, who was also a retired state police detective, continued to investigate Thomas's disappearance. Penny said that Tom wasn't a gun person. She had no explanation for the shell casing found in the car. She said that she had checked their guns and they were all accounted for in the lockup. She also said she hadn't noticed any recent changes in personality, nothing that might suggest he was depressed. But she did say he had a lot on his plate that year. He had been having trouble deciding what college he wanted to go to or what he wanted to study. And he had also recently broken up with his girlfriend, which also contained his high school issued laptop, was discovered 2 months later in January 2017 by Lake Marvin. Nothing suspicious was found on the laptop. No DNA was recovered, and it appeared to all be in good condition, despite being outside for several weeks. It had also been in an area that had been extensively searched in the days following his disappearance, so it was an odd discovery. 10 months later, in October 2017, his cell phone was found near where his backpack had been recovered, also in pristine condition, despite almost a year outside. In January 2019, over 2 years after Thomas Brown had disappeared, skeletal remains were discovered near Lake Marvin. Using dental records, they confirmed it was Thomas. The cause of death was never able to be determined, but they were able to say that he had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull. It also called into question how his body and vehicle had been found 14 miles apart from each other. The remains were found in a wooded area, 500 feet or about 1.5 kilometers from the road. If Thomas had committed suicide or had an accident around Lake Marvin, how did his car get to the water treatment plant? The private investigator involved in Thomas's case has reiterated that question several times. He also says that his evidence, which contradicts with law enforcement, shows that there is evidence to suggest Thomas had been attacked from behind and shot in the back of the head. He also said that he had a cadaver dog alert to the back of the vehicle, indicating a deceased person had been in the back of the car. He theorizes that Thomas was murdered in the front seat, pulled to the back, his belongings thrown out of the car on the way to Lake Marvin where his body was dumped, and then the car was abandoned near the water treatment plant, where the murderer was either picked up by another vehicle or escaped on foot, which still doesn't answer the question, who wanted Thomas Brown dead? At this time, this case is suspended, meaning it is neither closed nor active. The Office of the Attorney General took over the case in February of 2018 and has stated that until more evidence comes to light, there will likely be no progress on this case, and they are unwilling to categorize it as a homicide at this time. In a matter of days, Dennis Lee Bowman is set to be sentenced after pleading guilty to the murder of his adopted daughter, Andrea Alexis Bowman. For 30 years, the missing persons case of Andrea Bowman had gone without leads. The 14-year-old was alleged to have run away back in March 11, 1989, after coming forward with allegations that her adopted father was abusing her. When she was returned back into the care of her adopted parents, she had made the decision to run away. Dennis Lee Bowman already had a criminal past of harassing women, one that should have excluded him from being able to adopt in the first place. In 1980, he had been arrested when a young woman accused him of luring her to a secluded area and attacking her in Michigan. He pleaded guilty and made a deal with prosecutors at the time and didn't serve prison time. Perhaps due to his connection of being a naval reservist assigned to the USS Piedmont, in 2019, Parabon Nanolabs connected his DNA to a cold case murder, that of 25-year-old Kathleen Doyle. Kathleen had been assaulted and stabbed to death in 1980. At the time, Bowman was 31 and was in Norfolk, Virginia for a 2-week annual active drill. He was arrested for that murder in 2019 in Allegan County, Michigan. Upon his arrest and faced with multiple sources of DNA connecting him to the murder, Bowman confessed. Following his confession, the then 71-year-old was charged with burglary, first-degree murder, and rape. In that case, he had been sentenced to 2 life prison sentences and faced the rest of his life in prison. Also, while he had been awaiting sentencing for the previous murder trial, Bowman again made another confession. He told detectives that he had murdered his 14-year-old adopted daughter in 1989. He claimed that he had come home early and discovered Andrea packing a duffel bag. She also had some cash that had been in the home for emergencies, as well as cash from a tax return that had been waiting to be deposited in the bank. He claimed he had been angered and struck Andrea, causing her to fall backward down a staircase. He said that she broke her neck and he buried her in the backyard. Officers were deployed to where he said he buried her. Detectives in Virginia and in Michigan are concerned there may be additional victims out there, who had been her co-worker in the 90s, had repeatedly broken into her home. Michael John Olson had moved to West Palm Beach, Florida to advance his career. The 20-year-old was a passionate golf player and had hopes of working in some capacity in the golf industry. He was a business student at the University of Minnesota and had decided to take a year off to work and maybe get his foot in the door. Michael was described as responsible, a super likable guy that was reliable and very sweet. He grew up in Adena, Minnesota, where he had lived his whole life. He had grown up in a loving home, and he was close to his siblings and parents. He called his parents often to update them on his life, and they said he was very excited to start his new job. Shortly after his move, he got a job at the President Country Club. He hadn't secured an apartment yet, so he was staying at the Howard Johnson Hotel near the country club. He loved working at the country club. It gave him the opportunity to golf there when he wasn't working. Florida was the place to be for golf, and working at the country club gave him the best advantages. On Friday, November 30th, Michael had the day off. He had spent the morning golfing, and then he went to a local rental agency to find an apartment to rent. At 6 p.m., he met up with some of his coworkers at a dog track that was near his hotel. His friends say that he placed a couple of bets, but no one could say if he had won or lost that night. The group went to a nearby bar to watch a boxing match on the TVs, and then bar hopped until around 4 a.m. His friends said that Michael hadn't drunk much and was just hanging out. They said they dropped Michael off at his car, and he said good night, and I'll see you at work in the morning. And then he drove off. Michael didn't see them the next morning, as he missed his shift. His friends thought that was extremely unusual and called the motel. He also didn't answer the phone in his room. They called the front desk, who also tried to reach him, but had no luck. After their shifts ended, they drove by the hotel and noticed Michael's car wasn't in the parking lot. He drove a maroon 1979 Pontiac Grand Prix. The following morning, they went back to the hotel and asked the clerk if Michael had checked out. They confirmed he had not, and they tried to call him again. The clerk, concerned that Michael had left without settling his bill, called the police. On Monday, December 3rd, Michael Olson's parents were notified of his disappearance. His case turned into a suspicious disappearance. Police had initially assumed that Michael had just left, but his parents assured officers that he was excited about his job, that he was responsible. He kept regular contact with them and wouldn't have just left without telling anyone. His room was searched and all his possessions were still in the room, indicating that he had intended to return. It also didn't appear that he had ever made it back to his room after he left his friends in the early morning hours of December 1st. This was strange, because where he was dropped off was only about a mile from his hotel. Detectives' second theory was that Michael was somehow involved with more serious crimes, but his friends and parents confirmed that they had no reason to think Michael was involved with drugs, or had gambled away all his money. His friends had again stated that Michael didn't even drink that much. He was very committed to golfing and his career. There has been no further evidence uncovered in Michael's case. Neither he nor his car has ever been found. Again, in this case, there isn't really a lot of information about it. It doesn't appear to be actively investigated by the West Palm Beach Police Department. Michael's parents passed without ever knowing what happened to their son. But his siblings have continued on to try and keep his cold case active. They are still desperate for answers. Michael was 5 feet 8 inches and 165 pounds with brown hair and hazel eyes. On September 5, 2018, in the early morning hours, the Tucson Police Department received a call from 911 about a possible victim of assault, but the line was disconnected before officials could learn who made the call. They arrived at the 1600 block of West Prince Road in Tucson, Arizona, where a woman was discovered with possible stab wounds in the driveway of the apartment complex. The victim, 39-year-old Chundra Cruz, was unresponsive and pronounced deceased at the scene. Officers began a murder investigation. They surveyed the surrounding apartments and discovered that Cruz had been visiting a friend in an apartment across the street when someone said they saw a young man chase her across the road and stabbed her multiple times. Officers quickly identified the attacker as 21-year-old Brian Guzman Hernandez. Hernandez already had a criminal history, and it is unclear what had prompted him to attack Cruz. Hernandez is still at large. Authorities still have an active warrant for his arrest on first-degree murder, and he is considered to be armed and dangerous and not to approach. If anyone knows anything about Brian's whereabouts, they are asked to call Crime Stoppers. It has been 5 decades since Dolores de la Pena was kidnapped and brutally murdered. With many of the suspects now deceased, it may be difficult to get justice, but Philadelphia police are still working to solve this case. It was July 12, 1972, in Kensington, Pennsylvania, when 17-year-old Dolores de la Pena was on her way home. She had spent most of the day helping her mother with laundry. Her family had just come back from a 10-day trip from Florida, and it was their first day back. It had been a scorching hot July day, and she had stepped out to get a pack of cigarettes and see a couple of friends in the cool evening, but was expected to return before her midnight curfew. Dolores had just graduated high school with honors. She had plans to go to university in the fall to become an X-ray technician. After the trip to Florida, she had plans to spend the rest of the summer at the Jersey Shore. It was around midnight when Dolores was heading home. She had met up with a couple of friends and said goodbye as she got off her trolley stop. She was walking quickly home and only had a few steps more to get to the house when a car pulled up beside her and dragged her inside. Dolores was never seen again. Her parents noticed her missing right away, but had no idea she had been so close to home when she had been abducted. They called the police, and despite an extensive search, nothing came up about the missing girl. Then, 11 days later on July 22nd, a butcher in New Jersey discovered the torso and dismembered arms of a young woman along a rural road. Apparently dumped, it had been a shocking discovery to the community. A week later, an older man walking his dog discovered a leg 7 miles away from where the torso had been, and police were able to find a second leg nearby. Exhaustive searches were undertaken to recover a head, but it was never found. DNA was used to confirm that the body was Dolores. Injuries to her body showed extensive bruising and indicated that she had been tortured. No one could understand why a teenage high schooler had been brutally attacked in such a way. Years later, in the mid-1990s, a witness came forward that may have provided some answers to decades-old questions. He had been 16 at the time and had claimed to have been there when 6 men abducted Dolores. He claimed that the men were part of a local biker gang, one that he had also hoped to become a member in, and said the 2 people had identified Dolores as being the thief of a substantial amount of drugs. He said they kidnapped, tortured, and dismembered Dolores and dumped her body in revenge. Officers have conducted hundreds of interviews and interrogations in connection to Dolores' murder, but have yet to turn up any incriminating evidence. They say that most of the suspects they have are now deceased, but they are still committed to solving her murder officially. Dolores' parents passed before ever knowing what happened to their daughter. In 2020, they dug up a storage unit based on a tip and hoped to uncover new evidence, but the expedition turned up empty. They are still hopeful that new evidence will turn up or new witnesses will come forward. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. On May 24, 2016, Aubrey Jace Carroll's father, Michael, dropped him off at the bus stop. The Carroll family had recently moved from Griffin, Georgia, to Jones County, about an hour away. Despite the move, they decided Aubrey would finish the school year at Spalding High School, so every morning they made the long drive to the bus stop. Aubrey, 15 years old, was known as a kind and well-behaved kid who stayed out of trouble. It came as a surprise when Aubrey wasn't at the bus stop after school, prompting his stepmother, Leah, to go and pick him up. His father and stepmother called around various friends and relatives' houses, but no one was able to find the teen. They called the school, and teachers and staff said nothing it seemed to miss with the student. He had gone through the school day very normally, and had even sat for one of his final exams. Eventually, his father made the decision to report Aubrey missing. Initially, the case was considered a possible kidnapping, though detectives had been able to piece together a timeline of the days following his disappearance. They determined that following the end of the school day, Aubrey had gone to a friend's house where he had been allowed to stay the night. The following morning, he went to another friend's house, but he wasn't allowed to stay and had been instructed to go home to his parents, but he had been given breakfast and some water. He then walked to a third friend's house, where he asked for a ride to the nearest Flying J truck stop. From there, detectives say they lost track of the missing teen, which was May 26th. Aubrey's father and stepmother said they had no idea why their son would want to run away, though they did admit that Aubrey had gotten in trouble the previous weekend, but stated that wasn't a big deal and declined to elaborate on what that incident had been or the subsequent punishment. Aubrey's mother hadn't learned of his disappearance until weeks later, only learning of her son's disappearance from an Amber Alert on social media. She had been shocked to learn that her ex-husband and his wife actively deceived her. She had repeatedly tried to call and arrange visits with her son, but had been told he wasn't home or didn't want to talk to her. It had been this that made her suspicious of Michael and Leah. According to her, Michael and Leah ran a very strict household, and Aubrey was often getting in trouble for small things and constantly put on restriction, which was a frequent punishment that put limitations on him seeing his friends. Michael claimed that because it was clear Aubrey had run away, there had been no need to alert Aubrey's mother, because he was likely to turn up at any point and there was no evidence to suggest he was in danger. At that point, we felt like we were going to find him and everything was going to be okay. Michael said of the situation. Aubrey's case was listed as a runaway and the investigation quickly cooled. Aubrey's family had been critical of the Griffin Police Department, accusing the officers involved of not doing enough to find Aubrey. On Aubrey's 16th birthday, friends and family held a candlelit vigil in honor of the missing teen and to appeal to anyone who may have information about Aubrey. A year after his disappearance, his case was reopened. A new sheriff had taken over and wanted to start the case from the beginning. The sheriff's department had even offered a $5,000 reward to anyone who could confirm contact with the teen. In April of 2018, during the new investigation, detectives discovered a Facebook page that seemed to be Aubrey using an assumed identity. They searched the identity and discovered there were 5 incidents where Aubrey had encountered law enforcement and given them this new name. They had been able to track some of his travels from Alabama to Arizona and determined that he was traveling with a group of people who were also living a nomadic lifestyle. The families were notified of the Facebook page, but all had agreed to not reach out to Aubrey in case he went into hiding again. They decided instead to wait until law enforcement could catch up with him and pick him up. Now 17, Aubrey connected with FBI agents and was able to give them his story. He told us that he left on his own and had not been abducted, hurt, abused, exploited, or harmed in any way. He gave this video message to prove he was okay. After it was determined that Aubrey was safe and had left on his own accord, a family member reached out to him through Facebook. The family member convinced Aubrey to call his mother, which he did. He and his mother had several conversations and eventually he said he was ready to come home. However, there were certain conditions that he wanted in place, such as who he would talk to and where he would go when he got home. Aubrey returned home to his mother. Now, authorities and family members are just glad to know Aubrey is safe. How the story ended doesn't matter. Who gets credit doesn't matter, Sheriff Dick said. Aubrey's family, supported by friends and the tenacity of the investigators working on this case, saw this through to the end. What matters is that he is safe, healthy, and unharmed. Aubrey has said that in time, he will come forward with his story and reveal what his 2 years missing had been like. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.